Let's dive right in. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a topic that frankly generates an endless amount of speculation, geopolitical debate, and, a whole lot of eschatological theorizing. We're talking about the concept of a third temple in Jerusalem. But here's the thing. We aren't going to look at this through the lens of modern political desires or speculative futurism. We're not doing that today. Instead, we are going to conduct an exhaustive, forensic, and highly academic audit of the ancient source material. When you hear people talk about a third temple, it's almost always framed as this inevitable future certainty, right? Like it's just something waiting for the exact right political climate, or maybe just the right amount of funding, to finally be built. But what if the hard data tells a completely different story? What if the actual construction of a third temple isn't just unlikely, but structurally, legally, and forensically impossible? Well, today, we're going to rigorously examine the ancient texts, the historical records, and the foundational legal frameworks to show you exactly why the gears of this ancient machine have been permanently, irreversibly destroyed.
Okay, to really understand this, we need to start by defining a critical error that happens in almost every single conversation about a future temple. It's a massive blind spot. It's called the anachronistic transposition fallacy. To put it in terms we all deal with today, this fallacy is essentially like trying to copy and paste modern desires into a completely dead, ancient operating system. Imagine for a second finding a dusty software manual from the 1970s and trying to force that specific code to run on our brand new modern smartphone. You'd be entirely ignoring the fact that the original hardware literally doesn't exist anymore, the servers have been permanently shut down, and the parent company explicitly voided the software license decades ago. Proponents of modern temple reconstruction routinely engage in this exact fallacy. They are attempting to retrofit contemporary geopolitical aspirations on an ancient theocratic framework that no longer exists either legally or materially. They basically want the grand aesthetic of the ancient world without actually grappling with the strict, uncompromising legal mechanisms that actually made that world function in the first place.
So, consider this our syllabus for today's explainer. We're going to systematically dismantle these modern reconstruction claims piece by piece. We'll start with the fallacy of reconstruction, move right into the erased archives and broken lines of the priesthood, explore the insurmountable ritual purity deadlock, and then examine the loss of legal jurisdiction. Finally, we'll look at the explicit lexical nullification of the priesthood and the universal democratization of access.
Let's start with Section 1, the fallacy of reconstruction. To properly understand this entire subject, we absolutely have to adopt a highly skeptical, incredibly objective methodology and just totally strip away our contemporary biases. We must look strictly at what the ancient texts actually demand, not what we want them to say. Consider the sheer cognitive dissonance at play here. Proponents of a third temple suffer from massive confirmation bias. They fixate on the architectural blueprints found in prophetic books like Ezekiel. They look at the precise measurements, the courtyards, the altars, and they treat them like a modern construction schematic you'd hand to a general contractor. But concurrently, they systematically ignore the epistolary reality. They entirely bypass the explicit lexical abrogation, the legal voiding, of the sacrificial system found in the New Covenant epistolary texts. It is, frankly, the ultimate form of cherry-picking. You simply cannot claim to honor the ancient texts by obsessing over the blueprints while completely, conveniently ignoring the legal documents that explicitly voided the entire construction project. As we are about to see in great detail, the ancient texts don't just awkwardly stop talking about the temple, they legally and intentionally dismantle it from the inside out.
Moving on to Section 2, erased archives and broken lines.
You really have to understand that the ancient temple was not just a beautiful building where people came to pray or sing. It was a highly complex, incredibly rigid socio-legal machine, and that machine relied entirely on the gears of strictly verified genealogical datasets. Without the data, the machine literally cannot legally run. Biblical jurisprudence demanded an absolutely unbroken paternal chain of custody for anyone serving in the priesthood. You couldn't just volunteer for the job because you felt a calling or because you were really passionate about it. According to the book of Ezra, chapter 2, verse 62, these sought their registration among those who were registered by genealogy, but it was not found, therefore they were deemed polluted and put from the priesthood. Think of this exactly like modern two-factor authentication. If you don't have the login credentials perfectly matching the central database, you are locked out. Period. There is no override. In ancient Judea, if your ancestral paperwork wasn't pristine and verified in the central archives, your service at the altar was considered entirely illegal and actually polluted the sanctuary. The data was everything.
And this is exactly where history delivers a fatal, irreversible blow to the whole idea of a modern reconstruction. According to the historical accounts of Julius Africanus in this Epistula ad Aristidon, which was recorded by Eusebius, King Herod committed an act of massive, systemic political sabotage. Africanus states quite plainly, Herod burned the records of their families. Now, why on earth would he do this? Well, Herod was of Idumean descent. He wasn't Judean royalty. So to obscure his own lack of pedigree and to forcefully solidify his political power, he simply incinerated the central Judean archives. By burning the server room, so to speak, Herod permanently liquidated the primary foundational datasets that were absolutely necessary for legal Aaronic authentication. The very DNA required to legally operate the temple machine went up in smoke. It's gone.
But the destruction of the data wasn't even the only systemic failure. The actual chain of human succession collapsed as well. Halachic investiture, which is the strict legal process of becoming a high priest, absolutely requires a living predecessor to pass on the vestments in a highly specific 7-day ceremony. But according to the ancient historian Josephus in his work The Jewish War, this line collapsed into systemic mockery and total death in 70 CE. Josephus documents the installation of Phaneas ben Samuel, stating clearly that he was a man not only unworthy of the high priesthood, but that did not well know what the high priesthood was. Zealots literally pulled a random, entirely unqualified man out of the countryside and mocked the sacred institution right before the Romans violently destroyed the city. You cannot reboot a lineage when the actual physical chain of custody ended in terminal failure 2 millennia ago. The line is broken.
Let's look at Section 3, the ritual purity deadlock. Okay, so let's say, against all historical odds, you somehow had the genealogy and you somehow had a valid high priest. You don't, but let's just pretend you do. You still run headfirst into the brutal physical mechanics of sanctuary operation. This introduces the insurmountable paradox of extreme ritual impurity, which is known legally in the texts as tumat met. Let me carefully walk you through this because it's an absolutely irreversible paradox. To legally operate a temple, every single implement, every altar, and every priest must be ritually purified from any contact with death. According to ancient law, Step 1 dictates that defiled objects require a highly specific mixture containing the ashes of a flawless red heifer to be cleansed. But Step 2 is where the deadlock occurs. Creating new purifying ash requires a perfectly clean priest to officiate the burning of that new heifer. And Step 3 simply seals the trap. All ancient clean ash is completely exhausted. This is the tumat met legal deadlock. You literally cannot legally manufacture new purifying ash when the manufacturers themselves are already defiled. It's kind of like needing a perfectly sterile pair of gloves to open a sterile package of gloves, but your hands are already covered in thick mud. You are completely, hopelessly stuck.
And we know for a fact the ancient reserves are gone. According to rabbinic historiography, specifically Mishnah Para 3.5, 9 red heifers were prepared from the time they were commanded to fulfill this mitzvah until the temple was destroyed. This documentation confirms the total exhaustion of these absolutely vital, pure ash reserves. Without the specific ash from antiquity to cleanse a modern priest cannot legally burn a new heifer. The system is completely permanently gridlocked by its own rules. Any future consecration of a physical temple is structurally impossible based strictly on the very laws that would govern it.
Which brings us to Section 4, loss of legal jurisdiction.
We have to remember that a temple is not merely a building made of stone, wood, and gold. It's not just architecture. It is a strictly demarcated legal zone. It is a physical manifestation of ancient jurisprudence that requires continuous supreme judicial oversight to even legally exist. So the absolutely crucial point here is that you can't just buy a plot of land in Jerusalem today and start pouring concrete. According to Talmudic property law, specifically Mishnah Shavuot 2:2, they do not add to the city of Jerusalem or to the courtyards of the temple except by the authority of a court of 71. This specific court is the Great Sanhedrin. The physical expansion, the laying out of the boundaries, and the sanctification of the temple courtyard are all completely legally void without the explicit metrological sanction of this highly specific body of 71 supreme judges. If you do not have the Sanhedrin, you don't have the legal authority to even measure the ground, let alone build a sanctuary on it.
And when we map this chronologically, we see the complete, undeniable institutional eradication of the necessary socio-legal infrastructure. In 70 CE, we have the Roman destruction and the priestly mockery we discussed earlier. That was catastrophic. But the absolute final nail in the jurisdictional coffin actually came in 425 CE. According to the Codex Theodosianus, the Roman Empire issued a sweeping imperial decree abolishing the remaining jurisdictional authority of the Sanhedrin. The institution was legally and forcefully dissolved. Add to this the thoroughly documented 1624 CE extinction of the primary Samaritan Eleazar lineage, and you see a sweeping, centuries-long total collapse of the system. The exact judicial body required to authorize a temple was wiped off the map over 1,500 years ago.
Let's look at Section 5,
the lexical nullification of the priesthood.
So, we transition now from the historical destruction of the physical systems to the deliberate textual and eschatological dismantling of the Levitical charter itself. We are going to look closely at the New Covenant documents, which provide a total lexical nullification of the priesthood. This brilliantly illustrates the actual intent of the ancient authors. But first, we need to break down a very complex piece of Greek legal jargon for a second, athetēsis. Athetēsis is a highly precise legal term denoting absolute abrogation or annulment. It does not mean a temporary pause. It does not mean a suspension while we wait for better days. For our modern mindset, you really have to realize that the ancient sacrificial system wasn't just put on hold by the Roman exile, waiting for some future generation to press play again. Athetēsis means the contract was shredded. It was permanently legally voided by the very texts that redefine the faith.
And we see this exact word used incredibly deliberately in the New Testament texts. According to Hebrews chapter 7, verses 18 and 12, for there is an annulling, athetēsis, of a foregoing commandment because of its weakness and uselessness. For the priesthood being changed, there is of necessity a change now of the law also. This isn't poetry. This is an exhaustive, syntactical, legal ruling. The text explicitly states that the Levitical system was functionally inadequate. It uses the Greek concept of asthenes, meaning weak and useless for ultimate redemption. Because of this fatal structural inadequacy, the entire priesthood was completely changed, and the old law governing it faced terminal annulment. The old system isn't just sleeping, it is legally dead.
We can actually visually contrast this ancient legal segregation with its ultimate dissolution in the apocalyptic texts. Think about Mosaic segregation. According to Numbers 149, the law stated very clearly, "Only the tribe of Levi you shall not number." They were kept completely separate from the general population to maintain a localized, exclusive cultic monopoly. But contrast that with the eschatological dissolution. According to Revelation 7:7, which details the Johannine census of the tribes, it explicitly states, "Of the tribe of Levi, 12,000 were sealed." The tribe of Levi is suddenly and deliberately subsumed right back into the normative 12-tribe matrix. The authorial intent here is profound. It's the intentional textual stripping of the historical Levitical exemption. Their special, segregated status is gone forever.
Finally, Section 6, the universal democratization of access.
This leads us right to our final argument. If the old, segregated priesthood is nullified and completely subsumed, what replaces it? Well, the epistolary texts completely reassign the ontological status of cultic service away from a specific genetic bloodline, giving it directly to the entire populace. Let's look at the Greek word hieres, meaning priest. In the New Covenant texts, this is an ontological status systematically reassigned from a centralized, segregated caste to the entire universal ecclesia, the global community of believers. Think of it exactly like moving from a massive, highly centralized mainframe computer in the 1980s that only an elite group of trained technicians can ever access to a completely decentralized blockchain network today where every single person literally holds a node. This total democratization functionally obsoletes the very concept of a physical architectural temple. You absolutely do not need a localized building when the requirement for a localized priesthood is entirely dissolved.
And the texts themselves are incredibly explicit about this architectural replacement. According to 1 Peter 2:5, you also as living stones are built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. The New Covenant completely replaces physical masonry, the literal stones of a temple in Jerusalem, with living spiritual architecture. The people themselves are the stones. The people themselves are the priesthood. Furthermore, according to Revelation 1:6, and he made us to be a kingdom, priests to his God and Father. The transfer of power and status is total and complete. There's absolutely zero textual mandate to revert from a universal spiritual reality back to a localized physical building. It's a massive upgrade, and you don't downgrade once the new system is running.
So, let's pull all of this together and look at the final dossier. We have essentially reviewed a complete systems failure report today. The essential genealogies were permanently incinerated by Herod. The high priestly succession ended in systemic mockery and is functionally extinct. The required red heifer purity is locked in a totally irreversible paradox. Dirty hands simply cannot make clean soap. The Great Sanhedrin's jurisdiction to even measure the ground was imperially abolished in 425 CE. The Levitical mandate was explicitly lexically annulled in the book of Hebrews. And finally, the ontological status of the priesthood was universally democratized to all believers. Every single necessary gear of this ancient machine is completely, thoroughly, and permanently destroyed. So I want to leave you with this final thought to really grapple with.
If the physical architecture and the uncompromising legal framework of the past are permanently liquidated, not just put on pause but systematically dismantled by both history and the text itself, how does a universal, democratic priesthood completely reshape our understanding of the future? Maybe it's time to stop looking backward for ancient stones and start looking at the living architecture that was built to replace it. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today. Stay curious, keep looking closely at the data, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.